Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us on this BCI webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from in the world. My name is David West. I'm the BCI Head of Communities, and I'm just going to do a very, very brief introduction and some housekeeping before we start the main webinar. First thing I'd like to say is we are recording the webinar today, so you will get a chance to ask questions. Just please bear in mind, if you do ask a question, obviously the answer to it and the question itself will be part of the recording and put into the public domain. So just please bear that in mind when thinking about any questions you might have. If you do have questions, if you see on your control panel, you'll see that there's a questions tab towards the bottom of it. Type in your questions as they arise. It doesn't have to be at the end. Type them in whenever you think of them. And what we're going to do towards the end is we'll pull all the questions together and then we'll feed them to the presenters, and they'll answer as many as they can. If there are too many questions, we'll maybe answer some of them offline and publish the answers afterwards. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to the two main presenters. We're joined by Andrew Lawton, who is the Managing Director of Fortress AS, and also Dr. Sandra Bell, who is CEO of the Business Resilience Company. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Andrew and we'll start the main webinar.
Excellent. Thanks very much, David. And thanks everyone for joining. My name is Andrew Lawton, and I'm the CEO of Fortress Availability Services. We're a specialist in the field of operational resilience and business continuity. And of course, it's been a very interesting time in recent months. I spend a lot of my time speaking to those in that field about what's happening to their organizations and to their people. Of course, people are intrinsic to our businesses, and we need to ensure that people as that resource are as resilient as the rest of our infrastructure. Over the past month, I've seen a lot of people, organizations, put significant effort and money into the return to the office, setting the offices up in accordance with government guidelines to enable people to come back into that environment. What we're finding, though, is that actually few are either confident in coming back to the office or actually want to. And the realization is slowly dawning that the majority of staff will probably be working from home for the rest of 2020 and then possibly beyond that. And of course, it's these staff that actually are at risk, working at home in some ways, and we'll cover some of those. And of course, they also represent a risk to our organisations. And what we're going to do today is discuss some of the key areas of risk and some of the strategies that you can put in place to mitigate that risk. So just as to what we're going to talk about today, the story so far, obviously we've all been through it, but it's worth a quick recap to understand what on earth happened and why where we are. Some of the positives and negatives of working from home and the impact on employees and firms, and then look at some of the management challenges, in particular things like regulation, the law, tax and government, etc. Some of the complexities of management, and then Sandra's going to talk about management strategies and how to mitigate risk and improve productivity of remote working teams. And we're going to just briefly touch on how we might be able to help as well as an organisation. So the story so far, what on earth happened? Well, obviously, back in January, it was a problem for someone else. It was over in Wuhan. We saw the Chinese dealing with this infection, it becoming worse. And of course, those with a great deal of foresight had planned for pandemics. But to be fair, I don't think many had realised quite what the pandemic the effect a pandemic would have on the country. And so pandemic plans often dealt with individuals falling ill or large parts of the staff falling ill, but didn't really deal with lockdown I remember having conversations back in January, looking at China and thinking that it's all well and good, China locking a city down. That's never going to happen in Europe, particularly in the UK. But of course, 6 weeks later, there we were. In February, of course, the first cases appeared. There was that chap who'd just come back from skiing and settled back into his life in Brighton, and there were those small pockets of infection. And I think it was at that point that we slowly became aware of the real potential for obviously damage to our health, but also society, as the effects of that started rippling out. And then, of course, just a few weeks later, middle of March, we're all in lockdown. I think staff, many of them, were quite happy about working at home to start with, and there was that blitz spirit. We'll carry on regardless, whatever the circumstances, and we'll just, we'll sort of work on the sofa or work on a bed, and we'll continue working at whatever for company and country. But very shortly afterwards, it started becoming clear actually that wasn't. I mean, obviously, it's far from ideal. And the Institute of Employment Studies actually did a survey just 2 weeks into lockdown, and already at that point, some of the cracks were starting to show. And I'll touch or actually drill down into that study a little bit later on. And I think it's been over the past few weeks and in June and this month that as we've planned for staff to return to the office, we've also realised that actually not many of them will. And I don't think the current situation is going to go away anytime soon. In fact, the BBC reported just a couple of days ago that the Spanish had done a study that actually cast doubt on the feasibility of herd immunity. And of course, we're all sort of hoping that we're all going to become immune at some point. But it in this study actually showed that despite the massive impact and all the infections in Spain, just 5% of the population had had the virus. And of course, that's a long way from the 70 to 90% of a population that needs to be immune to protect the uninfected. And so without a vaccine, we unfortunately are going to be in and out of lockdown for a very long time to come, for the foreseeable future. And so we obviously wait for that vaccine to enable us to return to some level of normality. So what next for the office? Well, as we said, a few will return this year to their offices, but it is also clear that if 40 hours a week sitting at a kitchen table or a dining table or a sofa is just not sustainable, and people are going to start breaking. And if we look at the way that people are going to be working from home, our entire production, our office is going to be moving to the home. Along with that production moves our duty of care. And of course, we do need to bear in mind the health and safety and security and data control and other regulatory requirements that are put on us normally within an office that will also move to the home environment if our workers continue to work at home. Now, of course, the regulatory bodies have been fairly relaxed in recent months. I don't think that's going to continue, or at least it's going to tighten up as time moves on, as we move into this being the new normal, as people call it. And I think the regulators are going to start looking in more detail at specific areas of regulation. And I'll cover some of the ones that people like the FCA, for example, have raised as areas of note. The health and safety exec for information has said that as an employer, you have the same health and safety responsibilities for home workers as for other workers. And actually, we ran a poll last week and had quite surprising results this far into home working. It showed that nearly 40%, that's 28 plus the 9% there at the bottom, are still working from a kitchen table and kitchen chair or a sofa. Now, of course, we muddled through in recent months, but going forward, that obviously can't continue. Otherwise, things are going to start breaking. So let's look at some of the positives. and then some of the considerations that we need to bear in mind. I think everybody has reviewed this, and so I won't spend too much time on this. But of course, from an employee perspective, the work-life balance is greatly improved if you're working from home, and it enables you to work flexible hours. Most are saying that it improves their productivity and concentration. There are some that say otherwise, but it's certainly the minority that's saying that they prefer to work in the office. And of course, it provides them with savings on travel. They don't need to waste that time commuting. And from an employer perspective, it also provides a reduced overhead and a saving. And if the feedback I've had over recent weeks is true, then staff are more productive at home. In fact, I think the big problem is to sort of tell people to stop working and turn their laptops off and stop working those longer hours. So productivity is good, and of course, home working allows you to hire more broadly geographically, and it improves your hiring chances as being a flexible employer, and of course retention as well. And as a sort of side effect of your staff not travelling, you've got the added benefit of those green credentials and reductions of your carbon footprint.
And I think, Andrew, also, if I could just jump in there, is that we can't forget that these aren't just anecdotal findings. You know, there's hard scientific research that's backed these up. Now, home working, the academics have been studying this since about the 1970s, when we had the oil crisis and the 3-day week. And there's one particular study from Penn State University. Now, they looked at 46 different studies and involved 12,883 employees. And they found that from a psychological perspective, as you say, that working from home is associated with increased perceptions of autonomy, lower work-family conflict, but also crucially, it did not appear to damage the social ties with others at work, which is often cited as one of the main reasons why it's not more widely adopted. And also on that employer side, actually, that's also hard evidence behind that. So an employer, so from the University of Calgary, they looked at 22 independent studies of the business impact, and they found that it resulted in increases in productivity, as you say, retention, but also strengthened organizational commitment and improved their financial performance.
Yes, absolutely, and I think it's well known that that home working going forward, now the technology is capable, is going to prove beneficial for staff and for the firms. One of the key benefits that we've talked about, aside from productivity, is cost savings. And Lambert Smith Hampton do a total office cost survey every year. I think they've been doing it for nearly 20 years. And they have estimated that for a workstation in the city, it costs £13,000 a year all in to provide that space and the supporting environment. And if you're in the West End, that's actually £19,000. And the people that I'm talking to, the figure often bandied about is 40% reduction in office footprint, and or at least not taking additional space that maybe you were looking at taking going forward because of your company expansion. But if you do look at the 40% reduction in office space, that actually translates to a £5,000 per staff member per year. Now that's clearly a lot of money to be taking back into the business. Now, aside from that profitability increase, and then you've got the productivity increase, there's clearly financial benefit to the company of considering an increase at least of home working. I think ultimately there's going to be a balance between home and office. I don't think everyone's going to be working full time at home all the time, but I think there's going to be that balance, and people are going to definitely be working at home more more frequently and for greater periods of time. Sandy, I don't know if you've got any further comment on that.
Well, I think on really coming back to that profitability result, you've got a mixed sort of feedback on there. But actually, one of the main, the research shows that one of the main drivers of to achieving increased profitability is using home working, as you say, to add flexibility. So if all you do is, use technology to allow people to do exactly the same job as they would normally do in the office, but do it at home, then actually from that productivity stance, the gains are only going to be marginal. But actually, if you embrace that flexibility, if you look at, really bring in that home working as part of your sort of organizational model, more employees will be involved in the job design and planning. They will be more intensively managed by results. And then in turn, that can increase efficiency and boost the profit. Now, I think because the speed at which we had to implement home working due to COVID, many organisations have kept their same processes. But however, as you say, this isn't going to be temporary, especially as we heard yesterday about the airborne transmission. Then I expect to see people start to tweak their business processes. And then I think what you'll see is that profit will start to increase.
Indeed, indeed. So let's look at some of the management challenges. Obviously, as Sandy said, there are changes ahead, and I think we do need to adapt to those changes rather than simply do things the way they were done before, but just do them at home. But we do need to bear in mind some of the risks that are associated with home working, along with those process changes and management changes and strategy changes. So back to that home worker wellbeing survey. Again, this was just two and a half weeks into the lockdown, with people working at home for the first time. And even at that very early stage, you could see that there were really significant, 60% almost, increases in things like pain, necks and shoulders, backs, etc. Increases in leg cramps and chest pains, and people struggling generally to deal with longer hours or regular hours, working too hard often. I think generally, I mean, obviously there are going to be exceptions, but I think generally people feel duty bound to work, and maybe even work harder when they're at home. But I think one of the things that we do need to be mindful of are those that aren't in ideal circumstances. I mean, many of us on this call will be in sort of bigger houses with plenty of space, maybe with gardens out in the country, feeling quite comfortable about lockdown. But there will be others that are in flat shares or living with mum and dad, back with mum and dad after a period away, not in circumstances that they want to stay in for too long. Others that are caring for elderly relatives or homeschooling, which is definitely been a challenge trying to juggle that with work. And actually now, as we move into the school holiday period, actually that's even going to be more difficult, because homeschooling provided a focus for the day, and all the normal entertainment venues are not open, and even children's playgrounds are closed. So I think we do need to bear in mind our staff's personal circumstances, as they may be very, very different to our own. And so just in looking at some considerations for how we might approach our home workers. As I've said before, I think broken people will break businesses, and if we don't address this ahead of the problems, as opposed to sort of waiting 4 or 6 months for the problems to arise, if we don't catch this early, then people will start breaking. There will be health problems, mental health problems as well, that will impact these individuals, that will start taking them out of circulation as staff members. And of course, we also have a duty of care to ensure that they don't end up in that position as well. And as part of that, of course, we need to ensure that the home workspace is suitable. And that's a process of assessment, and it's something that everybody should do. Many have done that, and many are in the process now of doing that, and that is absolutely correct. That we need to understand the size of the issue, if you like, so that we can make clear decisions about the way forward. And when we do have our staff out of sight, we do need to make sure they're not out of mind. So that's for things like training, promotions, and engagement with the rest of the business, the team, the rest of the culture. Because if we forget that continued engagement that they would ordinarily get within an office, we'll start losing the loyalty and that sense of team that you get when you're in a physical office environment. And along with that loss of loyalty, you end up losing security and start having problems with potential insider threats or problems with other areas of security. And as we've said, we do need to think about our employees' well-being and stopping them working too hard. And I think actually currently, although there are people having holidays, in fact, I think there's one on this call. Many people aren't having holidays because it's very difficult to change your scenery and go on holiday, and so we do need to be careful that we don't end up with most of our staff with a full quota of holidays as we head into the last quarter and everyone wanted to take holidays at the same time. Now, regulation doesn't go away just as people move out of the office. Of course, we're under regulation in the office. All of those regulations will still apply as people move and start working more permanently at home. Of course, the one that's at the top of the list is health and safety. We do need to ensure that the environments are physically capable of allowing somebody to work for at least 40 hours a week, 48 hours a week. We spend money on desks and chairs and screens, etc., in the office for a reason, because we want to ensure that staff don't end up with injuries from sitting hunched over laptops, etc., for hours on end. Of course, we've also talked about the working time regulations and setting and agreeing work hours and availability. I think that's important. But we also have some of the other regulations that we would normally think of as part of our standard work environment. So GDPR, for example, or other data control. The FCA, I know, is particularly concerned at the moment about insider trading. And that home working arrangements might raise new or additional risks about identifying and handling that sort of insider information. And also, there is potential, of course, for market abuse. And I know that in their recent market watch back in May, they were reminding companies to maintain integrity and orderly function of financial markets. So it's something that they are keeping an eye on and will start now paying more attention to as it becomes clear that people are going to be working from home for longer periods. The other area is also money laundering. The Financial Action Task Force recently released a report on COVID relating to money laundering, and they are concerned that the increased market volatility, increased use of cash, the fact that people are working from home might actually increase the potential, or at least the risk of money laundering. And of course, IT security. When people move to the home environment, sometimes they forget things that they've been taught and trained about in the office, such as ransomware and phishing. And so it's worth reminding staff that actually these attacks are increasing dramatically in this period. So I think the criminals are taking advantage of the uncertainty and the lack of clarity, and so reminder training is well worth doing. The other area, of course, is insider threat. With people not being visible, and there's always going to be one or two those that want to do either harm, direct harm, or indirect harm to the business will be out there, and so we do need to make sure that the systems are in place to catch that. On the legal side, of course, any staff that have worked longer than 26 weeks have got the right to ask their employers if they can work flexibly. And of course, that could be a change of hours or times, but of course, places of work as well. So if they have moved to the home environment and actually felt, actually, this isn't too bad, I quite like this and I would like to continue, they are well within their rights, if they've worked for more than half a year, to ask for it to be more permanent. What's clear is that, and Sandra's going to be covering some of this in a few slides' time. It's important to develop specific frameworks that relate to your business, and home working policies specifically that do things including defining home working. What is home working? How is the company going to support that home working? Point out that the employee themselves have got responsibility for their own safety and for the safety of people in and around them as they work, and they of course need to report things to the HMRC. They need to adhere to the regulations. Just because they're at home, of course, that doesn't change. And the home working policy needs to allow you to remove or withdraw the home working if it isn't actually working. I think it's worth also stress testing those contracts. Of course, stress testing contracts generally under the new circumstances is a good plan, but stress testing your employee contracts to think through some of the circumstances that are going to be coming up over the coming months, and ensure that the contracts are still valid and will cope with those situations. On the tax side, certainly in the financial services arena, some staff have moved to other countries when they're working from home, and in fact continue to trade from home. And this is something that, again, the regulators are starting to frown upon, and that's not going to be allowed going forward. Obviously, we need to ensure that with things like Brexit happening and the various changes in the way that we are able, and the limitations to where we can trade and where we can work, and how the implications of to our tax position, all of those things need to be borne in mind as well. And I do know that companies are starting to call back their remote workers when they're working abroad. As we've said before, we do need to define home working because that has an impact on the tax and legal status. Just really for reference, you can provide tax-free reasonable additional household expenses up to the huge amount of £312 per year, and there are some circumstances which you can exceed that without having to pay further taxes on it, and your employee not paying further taxes on it. Sandy, I don't know if you've got any, again, further comments on those elements.
Well, I think it's sort of very thorough, Andrew, but I think the only one that I'd like to add is about insurance. Because last week I was reading a really good article in the FT about insurance and working from home. I know I really should get a life, but personal home and contents insurance is generally not designed to cover our home working. So in the short term, what we've seen is some insurers have simply just temporarily extended their existing workplace policies so that staff working from home have exactly the same coverage as they would have had in the office. But as we move forward and much more towards a more permanent working from home culture, they are really starting to rethink their positions. So insurers are starting to do more due diligence on their clients' home working protocols and the resilience around those home working protocols. Now that started on the cybersecurity front because, as we all know, there was a massive increase in ransomware attacks as the cyber criminals took advantage of COVID-19. But I think we'll really start to see that shift to other areas where employers have responsibilities to employees.
That's a good point. Very good point. I think moving on, in fact, just sort of preparing, I guess, for looking at how we can mitigate and reduce risk, but also improve productivity and the way that we look going forward at managing remote teams. Just wanted to touch on some of the complexities, and here I've simplified an org chart using the sort of the FCA's senior management certification regime, the SMRC, and that obviously defines who's got responsibility for what. But I wanted to pop this up here because when we have a single office or a number of defined offices with many staff in them, it's a much simpler. It's still not simple, but it's much simpler to manage things like compliance and HR and IT and facilities and all of those factors that the COO is interested in delivering the resources and infrastructure to run a business. It becomes more complex when those independent silos, in effect, of work and suppliers try to maintain and manage homework environments, and it does become difficult for one of those silos to take ownership. Now, ultimately, of course, it all reports into the COO, and I guess over time we will define one department that will do that, and maybe it is facilities that will take the lead, or maybe it is IT, maybe it is HR. You know, it really will sort of come out in time. But it's a complex area because ultimately, if staff are going to be working from home permanently, then their infrastructure and their environment is really the company's infrastructure and environment. And on that note, over to you, Sandy. I think I'll try to make you presenter.
Thank you.
You know what? I can't. Bear with me a second.
Okay, as we sort of try to change over the sort of presenter mode. I think if we go back, actually, sorry, Andrew, I think
That not worked.
it nearly has worked out. I'll just set the.
Well, I'll click on then, shall I? And
Sandra, you just need to share your screen now. You are presenter, so just share your screen, and we should see that.
Oh, screen. Yeah, you click on. Yeah.
Yeah. So I will move things back to me then, shall I? The wonders of modern technology.
Okay.
So
No, it's come through.
Good.
Does it come through to me, David?
You're presenter now, Sandy. So if you share your screen, that's it. We've got that.
Can you see my screen?
We can see your emails at the moment, so you need to pop up your slides.
Oh, that's not what you want to see at all, is it?
Here we go.
It's the wrong screen. Okay.
Got it.
Would be the wrong screen, wouldn't it? Right. Thank you, Andrew, and apologies to everybody there, for that technical glitch. So as we've heard, you know, the need for large numbers of people to work from home is not going to go away. You know, COVID-19 is going to be here for a while. January 2021 being the earliest that we people are expecting a vaccine. In closed spaces, are going to become troublesome. They already are, but not just because of the difficulty of social distancing, but also, as we're now seeing, airborne transmission is a bit of a problem. And likewise, measures to combat climatic change are likely to further, put pressure on restricting travel. Now, as Andrew's, covered, embracing home working can be good for both the employee and the employer, but there are risks. Now, Andrew's spoken about the practical risks, and he will also talk about how Fortress can help you manage those a little bit later. But before we move on to that, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the management and leadership strategies that organisations need to have in place to get the most out of sort of home working. So, two of the most common definitions, I thought we'd start with an organisation. So two of the most common definitions of an organisation are, number one, something that allows individuals to come together to achieve a common goal. And the second one is an organised group of people with a particular purpose, such as a business or a government. So regardless of the organisational structure, the building block of organisations are teams. And so essentially they've got what you can see on the screen here. You've got people that can work together within a formal structure. They've got policies and they've got strategies which hopefully decide that decision making to put that action in place. They have an understanding of the environment that they work in, and especially in the modern organisation, they've got a technological understanding and access. Now, all of these elements are glued together within structure, policies, process, and culture, and not to mention the information, to form a complex socio-economic structure, or what we call an organisation for short, in order to get profit, growth, competitive advantage. Now, the challenge that we have for leadership and management that's facing us at the moment is to extend the boundaries of that thing that we call an organisation to encompass those home workers, as you can see on the screen here. And the idea is that the whole is got to be greater than the sum of the parts if we're going to get a good profit increase from that. Now, that might, with technology and everything else, that might seem quite straightforward. But I think it's worth pointing out that there are some gotchas, some sort of counterintuitive things that happen when you start mixing people that are in an office with working with people outside an office. So here are my top 5. I've been managing blended teams for years and years and years, and I've probably fallen foul of most of them throughout my career. So the first one is managing home and office team members in exactly the same way does help equity concerns. You know, people think they're being managed, or somebody's getting an easy ride at home and it's harder in the office. But it doesn't motivate those home and office team members to start to extend themselves to help each other out, which is what a team is all about. So therefore, from a management perspective, you have to have more active management to assist that performance and that integration. Now, the second one, you might feel as if you should be, communicating an awful lot more with the people at home. And absolutely, frequent one-to-one management contact with the home workers does actually help that individual manager-worker relationship, but it does not boost the team performance. Because the team performance need a shared awareness. They need help with sequencing and member coordination of inputs and outputs of the work. So it's not just when you do that communication, it's not just building the rapport and making people feel as if they're part of it. It's actually real practical scheduling help that normally happens, naturally when people are together. Number 3, it may feel intrusive about asking for work-family separation. And Andrew talked about, the challenges that people are going to have coming up in the summer holiday with, homeschooling sort of coming to an end. But actually, the research shows that home workers actually welcome that intervention and that creating of boundaries. So from a leadership and management perspective, you need to be prepared to start coaching the employees on providing that separation of demands and help them put that in place. Now, trust is absolutely fundamental. But the interesting thing is, it's not the home workers, or the manager's trust in the home worker or the office workers' trust that the home worker is pulling their weight. It's actually the home workers' trust in the manager that is the critical success factor. Because not only are the home worker out of sight, out of mind, actually their manager is out of sight, out of mind. So actually the manager has to display a much more positive stance on the employees' arrangements, that fair and equitable treatment, and conduct a results-based performance evaluation rather than just increase that face time. And the fifth one I have is that although there is almost always a greater focus on task and objectives as opposed to process with home working when you're overseeing and managing, what people find is that rather than a transactional approach where you sort of swap rewards for effort put in, actually it's a transformational management style that is usually much more effective than that transactional style. And that is because blended teams where people are in different places need to see the big picture. They need to see what everybody else does, and they need to see how they fit in. So how do you make that work? Well, number one, step one, you're going to have to make some tough decisions. So sadly, when it comes to blended teams, you can't have your cake and eat it. And so therefore, there are sort of 5 big decisions that you need to make. So the first one, as I spoke about, is that monitoring. So do you monitor the people the same to promote that equity? Is that important to you? Or do you promote monitor them differently so that you can increase the home workers' trust on you? And that is something that you will have to weigh up dependent on your culture and the type of organization you're in. The second one is about that regulation of work hours and schedules. And now you can take advantage of 24-hour working. You've got a bigger pool, as Andrew says, you can go out to do. You can work 24/7. So do you regulate to ease your coordination issues as a manager, or do you leave everyone free to promote that horizontal communication and mutual support? Essentially, that means as a manager, letting go of a little bit of control. Communication. Do you spend more time on relationships to promote cohesion, or do you promote joint awareness to increase team output? On the boundaries, do you exert those boundary controls and to help the home worker balance commitments, or do you leave them free and risk them putting some barriers up? And then finally, there's that leadership style. Can you let go? Do you adopt the transactional style and keep a tight rein on those individual task completions? Or do you let go and actually adopt that transformational style that lets everybody see the big picture? And then once you've done that, the next step is to increase some emphasis on some normal aspects of teamwork. Now, the model I'm showing here is a thing called the GRPI model. That doesn't stand for anything more sort of convoluted than goals, roles, processes, and interpersonal relationships. Now, the premise of the model is that the goals in the team, for all teams, whether they're sort of blended teams or completely in the office, is that the goals lay the foundation for good teamwork. They establish the core mission and frame its purpose. The goals set the direction for the team, help them define where they want to be, and also to unite individual effort in getting there. Now, the roles clearly define each team member's authority, responsibility, and tasks, and they need to be aligned in order to support the defined goal. Now, for a normal team, any team, you need three things. Each team member should have a clear picture of who is doing what, who is responsible for what, and also should know the extent of their own authority. Number two, each team member needs to understand and agree and also be satisfied with their roles and responsibility. And number three, each team member has to understand that they are accountable individually, but also collectively for that output. The processes are all about governance. So it's a governance tool to overcome the inefficiencies in areas of decision-making, control, coordination, and communication. So setting standardized processes will effectively support the team's goal and determine the interactions within the team. So obviously that's really important when people aren't co-located. And the final one, the interpersonal relationships, that's about establishing the trust, the open communication and feedback in order to support a sound working environment, to encourage creativity and diverse contributions from every member. However, when it comes to extending the team boundaries, you need to do all of that. But when you extend in terms of time and space, and hey, don't I sound like Doctor Who, there's a few extra things that you need to take into consideration. So the first one is at that top, those goals. Now, the value of team collaboration must be made apparent to all members. Home workers need to know that their work is really important and it will be recognised as significant, not just to the other members of the team, but also to the rest of the organisation. Nobody likes to feel ignored. At the second bit on the roles, each team member's role and purpose for being part of that blended team needs to be clear. And the important part of this is it's not only what they do, but also where they're doing it from. The rationale of why they're in the office or why they're at home at any particular time is really, really important and needs to be made explicit. On the process side of things, now communication is going to be happening via the computer-mediated technology. And that means that people have to have a shared accountability to the team for processes and protocols, and they need to be emphasized. And you also need to emphasize compliance. Frequent and continuous communications must be made more important. And then finally, the interpersonal relationships. What you have to do as a manager or a leader, because there is that tendency to task orientation, the managers need to make additional efforts to make the virtual environment where the collective team comes together to be as friendly and as human as possible, so that people share and they work together and that trust is built. So I'm now going to hand back over to Andrew, who will carry on with the presentation. Well, I hope I'm going to hand back to Andrew. Change. Presenter. I think you have control.
Hopefully you can see my screen now, not my emails. Good. Well, thanks very much. And I think covering some very useful points. I think the challenge we've got in this webinar is that it is actually a pretty extensive subject, and cramming everything in to just the 1 hour we're just scratching the surface. But what I did want to do was just spend literally a minute on the Fortress AS Home service. For those that do know us, they'll know that we have Fortress AS Enterprise, which is our work area recovery and colo data center infrastructure resiliency type services. But we also have Fortress S Home. Fortress S Home is, as the name suggests, focused on building the resilience into the home work environment. And it starts by agreeing the set of standards, and of course that's not just the health and safety, but also technology, security, and process standards that the firm wants the home worker to adhere to, and also for their standards for their support as well. Assessing those home workers and their work environments and their processes against those sets of standards. Obviously, then there's a reporting phase in which we set out which are, I guess, those the green, amber, and reds. The greens are those that are working at home absolutely fine. They have the right environment. They're adhering to all the processes. There are those ambers or oranges that need a bit of work, whether that's a new chair or a separate keyboard, or whether they need to review some of the processes that they're adhering to. And then there are going to be those that actually fit into the red category, which are their home work environment just is never going to be able to be brought up to the standard that they will need to for long-term home working. They're in flat shares, and that's not the environment, for example, to undertake work on a merger and acquisition, or do some form of trading in an open environment where people are sharing the same Wi-Fi and sharing the same space. So once we've defined who those staff are, and those that need some additional work, we'll work with the company to ensure that staff have the right environments and their processes, and that sometimes involves some training. And then over time, we can then support that, maintain it, and that again includes resilience, where we provide disaster recovery in effect. So if the PC or screen or chair or whatever resource the staff member needs is no longer available, we'll replace it normally within 24 hours. And if it's for a PC, for example, it would be pre-imaged, so that the staff member just simply plugs that back in and they're back up and running. Over the top, we have advisory, so we talk about the management of remote teams, and also training we've talked about, and then in support of all of that, we have the infrastructure. So that can be technology, but it also does include things like meeting rooms and training spaces, etc. So you can sort of think of it really as, in effect, a sort of fully serviced office for a home worker that specifically meets the standards that the company needs. So in summary, today we've talked about the fact that actually it looks as though staff members will be working from home for a long time, and fingers crossed the vaccine arrives in January and we can return to much greater normality. But in the meantime, 40 hours or more working at a dining table or a sofa or bed is just obviously not sustainable. We do need to make sure that we're looking after our staff's health and well-being, because they are, looking at it black and white, they are resources for our business, as well as all the other resources that our businesses rely on, and we have a duty of care to ensure that their well-being is maintained. Compliance actually has some significant benefits to come along with it, but we do need to think and plan about how we are going to change our businesses and our practices and our management strategies to cope with the new way forward. Now, I know we've sort of run very close to the end of time, but David, are there any questions that we can quickly run through?
So at the moment, we don't have any questions. If anybody does have any, if you just want to type them into the question box now, we've got a few minutes left before the hour, so we should be able to field those to Andrew and to Sandra. So if we're okay to just wait for a moment, Andrew, while people are typing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, we got our first question in from Rob Wally. Home internet challenges. Does your service consider internet enhancements such as dual SIM routers, etc.?
That is something actually that we can provide. So for those that live out in the country and are used to BT's slow wired internet. Sorry, I shouldn't have picked out somebody in particular, but standard wired internet out in the countryside is quite slow, and actually using SIM-based 4G internet is much faster. And nowadays it provides great resilience, in fact. And where there are problems with internet, then we can ship out the MiFis to provide that internet at very short notice.
Great. Okay, we don't have any more questions at the moment. So if anybody does have one, now's the time to ask it, because you'll be right at the front of the queue. So yeah, really just a comment from Rob, same Rob again in a question. Sandra, really useful insights on the tips for home worker management. Some team members find over communication a challenge. Have you had any experiences of good ways to manage this?
Is that Rob?
Yeah.
Hi, Rob. Yes, it is really difficult, because one of the things is that I think the research shows that when you get an interruption, it takes 15 minutes on average to get back on track. And so typically when people are thinking about working from home, and you especially if you're having sort of blended and you're not always working from home and sometimes you're working in the office, then you tend to stack up all of the things that need a bit of concentration and do those at home, and then you get all of those interruptions in communications. I think the only way to do it is actually have sort of regular diarized team meetings, and take control of the communication. Now, we're always taught as managers and leaders is that you should have your door open and people should come and see you whenever they need to. But actually, you need to take the upper hand in a virtual scenario, and you need to take the control of that going out. I mean, it does pay dividends, because actually, if you take that control, then you also neutralize some of the political communications that go on. But I think it's a case of learning, what other people's preferences are in your team, and then, collectively deciding when you're going to get together.
Okay, great, thank you. We've got a couple more questions now. The next one is, do you find fraud risk more prevalent during this time?
Fraud risk. Well, certainly, I don't have any stats on whether it is more prevalent, but certainly it's something that I know the regulators are specifically looking at, and many of those, in compliance and risk are looking at specifically. There is the opportunity, of course, and it's something that we need to be very sort of mindful of. That sometimes those, sometimes some of our staff members aren't always as loyal and careful with data as they possibly should be, and as they're out of sight, they may feel that they're going to take an opportunity. So unfortunately, I don't have any stats on whether actually fraud has increased. But as I say, the regulators are looking at that. They've raised it as a flag to be aware of.
I think, I mean, not related to sort of home working, but certainly through COVID-19, supplier fraud risk has increased dramatically. As people have sort of scrabbled around where their normal supply chains have been disrupted, and people are desperately trying to get hold of whatever they need, then a lot of the sort of checks and balances that would normally put in place have sort of fallen by the wayside. And what they normally rely on is having the sort of internal audit and having the accounts payable and the procurement people absolutely joined at the hip. And normally in a normal office environment, they're all in the office because of the master supply list being sort of, as Andrew said, it's one of those ones that is very, very important, and from a security perspective. But what we've seen over the past few months is people employing a lot of sort of diagnostic technology to actually reduce that and to put that anomaly detection in. So, one of the other things is, AI really has started to, come to the fore as part of that, fraud risk reduction.
Okay, thank you. One very last question then, just before we finish, from Stephen Marshall. Do you need more managers or less managers in remote situations?
I think you can get away with less. Most people find you can get away with less. Because that's if you get the trusted place. Because if you think, there's in terms of an organisation, people can track their time. So quite frequently, people, there is a layer of middle management which are, supervising adherence to process. If you get it right, you do that transactional, not transactional, the transformational leadership where everyone's bought into the vision, the team's working correctly, and everybody trusts each other, then actually you can flatten the organization. And so a lot of the, a lot of the profit in some of the studies have because you can actually take out a whole layer of middle management. But you have to get it right, and the trust has to be there in order to do so.
Okay, great, thank you. We don't have any more questions now, and we have hit 4 o'clock. So thank you so much, both Andrew and Sandra, for that. Really interesting, really great content. The recording will be put on the BCI website within 24 hours. If you go to the BCI website and hit knowledge at the top of any screen, then you'll see our library of all our previous webinars, and this one will be included within 24 hours. So thank you everybody for your time in joining us. Thank you again, Andrew and Sandra, and hopefully you will have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone. Bye.